Alarm, alarm. Hello, you are listening to We Have Ways of Making You Talk with me, Al Murray and James Holland. And you could probably tell from the background noise, we're on one of our excursions, aren't we, James?
We are. We're in the atrium of the Imperial War Museum.
Yep.
And so that's why if it sounds a little bit kind of sort of echoey, that'd be why. And always just a great joy to be here. I mean, the hours I've spent at this place is ridiculous.
Yep.
Not least in their reading rooms, which used to be in the lovely old tower at the top of the building. And then a few years ago they changed it and you now have a different reading room, which actually, if I'm brutally honest, might not be as aesthetically pleasing, but from a working point of view is better. And that's where I kind of, be pouring through diaries and memoirs and papers and so on.
People who've come here as a tourist, as a casual observer, in off the street in the rain, it's an atrium with a Spitfire dangling in it, and now a Harrier and
a V1
and a V1. Yes, with both the Vengeance weapons.
Yep.
You might be familiar with that, but this is a working museum. It's a working archive.
Yes.
And we have someone who works at the museum. That's a linkage for you that you get on this podcast. John Delaney. And John,
Hello.
Welcome. So we have ways, and you have tell us your title. You've got a fantastic job title, haven't you?
A very long job title. It's officially Head of Second World War and Mid-20th Century Conflict.
Right.
And it wasn't my fault. I didn't start it.
but we've already learned, haven't we, that you're not quite mid because you stop at 1949.
Yeah, 29 to 49. I've got a colleague, Carl, who takes over at 49, and he's Head of Cold War,
which is just brilliant.
But
isn't it?
if you subscribe to the short 20th century theory, which is what the 1918 to the end of the Soviet Union, you're not in the middle either, are you?
No,
I was just
never
trying to help
mind.
you out there.
A misnomer. Just Second World War. That'll do.
And you've been in Imperial War Museum your whole career, right?
26 years.
Right.
Holy moly.
Yeah, a long time.
That's good effort.
Started at the Imperial War Museum in London, spent a lot of time at Duxford looking after the large objects.
Yeah, well, we love it there as well.
And now I'm back in London.
By large objects, you mean aeroplanes?
Aeroplanes, tanks, that sort of thing.
Right.
And John, I mean, this building, I mean, it's historic, isn't it?
Yes, it was the old Bedlam Mental Asylum, so some people say a very apt place for a war museum. Before it became...
Is this the Bedlam that people used to come and look at the lunatics at then?
It moved here probably slightly post
After
that date,
right,
but
okay.
it was the same institution.
Right. Wow. Gosh.
So when did it become a museum here?
It's in the First World War, wasn't it?
It became the park was given.
Right. Know it all.
The Imperial War Museum as a museum started out at the First World War. At the end of the First World War, there was a great movement for a new national museum to commemorate the fact that all this sacrifice had, the Great War, as it was known then, had just finished, and there was a need for a national monument to those who had participated and sacrificed.
Yeah.
And then it grew from there, and obviously they didn't at that point know there was going to be a Second World War, but our remit, which is an act of parliament, we exist by an act of parliament as opposed to a charitable status, is to record the conflicts that Britain and the Commonwealth have been involved in since 17.
Hence, I mean, because we have other, more. Because my memory of this place is of a Spitfire, the London bus that used to be here in the atrium.
Monty's Grant tank.
Monty's Grant tank, and these things have all moved to other sites. Because after you've Manchester,
we've got HMS Belfast, Manchester, Churchill War Rooms.
What did happen to Monty's Grant tank?
Monty's Grant tank is on display at Duxford. Should you wish to visit it, I'll show you.
Okay, all right.
Along with his caravan.
Yeah, I've seen the caravan. I just don't remember the tank. Okay.
Now, then we have a Monty item here, don't we?
We do, yes.
That you've a personal connection to.
Yes, well, when it was restored and put back together because it was in quite a bad way in about 2008 to 2012 when the new atrium here was reopened, and I was the curatorial advisor at that point on the restoration project for that Humber.
Of the Humber?
Yeah.
Well, should we go and have a look at it?
Yeah, sure.
Brilliant. Let's go. We're going past the T-34, but we're not going to say anything about it.
No.
James. We're
saving that for the summer, aren't we, Al?
It's a post-war build one. Is
it?
Yeah, it's not a 1944 one, but there's little giveaways that give it away.
Right.
What, is it made with more finesse than the wartime one?
Slightly more finesse, slightly less poor welding, but still poor welding nevertheless.
Right.
Yeah, you do pity the crews that are in it.
Yeah.
I mean, it is not. It is very, very cramped. It has to be said.
Right.
We just silkily move past the Merlin.
Yeah, it's a Mosquito Merlin, a Merlin 25.
So here it is.
So
and we know
the Humber's around the corner here.
Humber's around the corner. Oh, look at that.
Wow, look at that. That is amazing. It's a thing of beauty, really, isn't it?
Yeah, it
it's
really is.
It's so unmistakably British.
Yes, it is rather, isn't it?
That's because it's khaki, James.
No, it's not just because it's khaki. There's something about it that just says British
So
engineering.
what state was it in at the start of the restoration?
It was in quite a poor state because after the war it was presented to the Roots Group, who were the manufacturers, Humber, and they used it as sort of a show and tell vehicle for their clients to say, look, what we did for the British in the war.
Yeah.
And then with the decline of the British motor industry, it was purchased, the Roots Group was purchased. In the end, Peugeot became the holding company that owned the Humber. And
this is a Humber.
It's definitely a Humber. They had no real need or want to look after this.
Inclination.
Because it wasn't a Peugeot.
Right.
So it was basically left. We found out about it. It was on loan to us for a little while, and we said, if you ever want to get rid of it, we would really, really like it for the collection. It came to us in about 2008-ish. And then we immediately began a restoration project on it.
And we know that it was Monty's.
Oh yes, absolutely, yes. It had a plaque on the side of it when it came to us from the Roots Group, and we've traced its history back through wartime photography and film footage and cross-referenced. So you were talking earlier on, for example, about the paint scheme, the khaki and the sand.
Yes.
We got photographs of it from the Second World War and copied them exactly as it was being used in the North Africa by Monty.
So this is for his North African
This is
car.
yeah.
So this
He
is-
had three cars. Monty never one to have more than less than one of anything. He had Old Faithful, which served him in North Africa, and then the beginning of the Italian campaign.
Yeah.
Then he left it behind when he came back to the UK to take over for Normandy, and then. He had a second Humber which went with him into Northwest Europe, and he also had a Rolls Royce which he acquired.
And a B-17.
And a B-17. It was all sorts of...
in the bulge battle. Yeah. The thing is, I mean, this is I mean, we've talked about Monty quite a lot on the podcast, and I'm fascinated by him, and I'm fascinated by the way his reputation became tarnished, and actually there's a sort of pushback now amongst historians to reappraise him and to give him a fairer crack of the whip.
I agree.
But to actually have his car, you know, it's this thing that we run into a lot with history. He's a real person if he's got a car. He's not a guy in a history book.
Absolutely.
Well, I think one of the exciting things that you know how much I bang on about going and walking the ground and stuff, but it's also that tactile link you get when you are touching and handling objects.
Although please
do
do
used.
not touch or climb, James.
I know, but I'm going to.
You're inclined to- oh.
He's got special permission.
And so to restore it, what state was it in? Was it a rusted hull?
Pretty much. To give you a good illustration, because the cars were of a standard, so there was a separate coach builder, as there would be sort of things like Rolls Royces and whatnot, to do the interior to the specifications required, and all that original interior leather finish had perished over the 70 years. So we very carefully removed it and replaced it with exact copies, but. Because of the historical authenticity, and we knew Monty's bum had been on this seat, those original pieces of shabby leather we've still got in plastic bags in a climate-controlled store. So we don't throw anything away. We keep all the original pieces.
If there's a fleck of Monty's DNA, we could Jurassic Park him.
Yeah, well, you possibly, maybe, if you could search about in there and find some stuff.
Literally, the mosquito in the amber is where Monty's blossom has
it's
been.
got those indicators.
You get little stalk indicators.
Little struts, aren't they? The stalks that come up because it doesn't have lamps.
The one thing that's missing off here that was on here when he was in North Africa, you can see there's a little, you can't quite see it, but just dead centre in the middle of the bonnet, there's two bolt holes. He had a Bagnall sun compass on the centre of the console, because again, if you're operating in the desert, one of the main things is
Bagnall, of course, is the pre-war desert explorer who then is one of the pioneers of the long-range desert group.
Yeah. Right. So and we've only got one in the collection, and I didn't want to leave it on the hood of the car.
I mean, the interesting thing for me about this is having seen Rommel's equivalent, which is a very, very, very nice horse. It's just a different league of comfort to this, which again just tells you so much about the German and the British way of approaching the war. You know, with the British, it's all keep it as cheap as possible, cheap and cheerful, pragmatic. You know, yes, some comforts, but not too many. Whereas in Nazi Germany, if you're the top dog, you get an absolutely amazing.
Prestige
you know,
is,
I mean, you know,
everything's in the language of prestige.
of course, you know, Rommel is in a chateau in Normandy. Monty's in his caravan, and you can see those caravans obviously up at Duxford, and you know, in terms of luxury, they're not luxurious at all.
Stole them anyway, didn't he? Or liberated them.
Yeah, two of the three caravans were stolen from Italian generals.
Yeah.
But this car, I mean, you can see it. It is not the lap of luxury by any stretch of the imagination. Okay, it's nice. It's got leather seats and stuff, but this is pretty spare. I mean, that is not the most comfortable back seat you've ever sat in.
No.
Whereas if you sit in this Porsche, I mean, goodness me, it's absolutely amazing that it's just dripping with leather and comfort.
John, if I does it go?
It will go.
Run?
Well, it probably won't now because it's sat here for 5 years. But when it came from Duxford to here in 2012, it was a runner. Yeah, we got it back into running condition.
Incredible.
Yeah, isn't that brilliant? They're lovely cars, aren't they? They really are.
Yeah.
I mean, solid, reliable, dependable, all those things.
And Monty sat in the back, did he?
He did.
Yeah.
We've got lots of really good photography of this car in use. But when we wanted to restore it to a particular point in time, because even during its relatively brief service in North Africa and Italy, it was repainted at least 3 times by the workshops. So we needed to make sure we got a set of photographs from that period that covered the car and the camouflage scheme from every angle.
Right.
So you got it exactly right, because you couldn't just do one side from late 1942 and one side from mid 1943 because it just wouldn't look right.
Yeah.
So after a lot of research, we found one set of photographs where a cameraman had diligently walked all the way around the car, and that's the one we copied.
And you've got this rail here behind the front 2 seats and between the front 2 seats and the rear seat. So if Monty's sitting in the back and he wants to stand up and wave at the chaps, he can stand up and he's got something to hold on to.
He'd use this for trips from his TAC HQ to see other his divisional commanders.
Absolutely,
for his frontline trips, for those, because when he got to the desert, the thing he made a real point of was being visible.
Yeah, absolutely. He did a lot of tours to the frontline units, making himself known, putting a face to the name, which a lot of the previous commanders perhaps hadn't done as much.
Yes, it was very much his approach, and experiments with hats.
Yeah,
and all that sort of there's the bush hat with all the badges on, and eventually winds up on the
He would always take boxes of cigarettes with him, even though he didn't smoke himself, because he knew that's what the men in the field would want. Took them with him and handed out cigarettes wherever he went.
Yeah.
Again, get your face known, get yourself known as a person who cares about, thinks about the men in the field.
The importance of morale. It's what Jonathan Fennell's been writing about, but it's I've been thinking about this a lot over Christmas actually, and one of the things I've really come to the conclusion that once the Western Allies get the operational level ready and then combine that with an understanding of the importance of morale, that is when fortune starts to turn. And you can actually pinpoint it to that moment that Alexander and Monty turn up in the Western Desert. And they go, right, no more retreats. And they suddenly, stop the rot, go out, start talking to everyone, explaining what the situation is, why they can feel confident, how everything's going to be different. And it just starts to change.
But even though you've got progress in the systems in 8th Army at that point, that they have sorted out their artillery, and they have sorted out their cavalry charges, and they have sorted all the things that needed to happen institutionally were already underway. It's that
combination. It's the combination of the right amount of supplies of the right stuff, and basically the kit is fine. I mean, even by the fall of Tobruk in June 1941, the kit's okay. You've got Grant tanks, you've got plenty of good guns, you've got everything. The machine guns are perfect. Everything's good. The problem there is one of morale and leadership at that higher level, and that's what changes, and it's that harnessing of the two things I think is really, really
rather
interesting.
necessarily than will, which is the thing.
Well, will is the Nazi way.
Well,
of
but it's
doing
also,
things,
but it's also,
Triumph
but it's
of the
also,
will.
but it's also a thing that people talk about in strategic terms. When you win a war, you've enforced your will on the enemy.
Right.
It's rather than will, it's morale in order to do that. There's always this, this confusion of means and ends, if you want.
Right.
If you see what I mean.
The
Nazis thought that will was the
was everything.
Whereas in fact it's just one of the things at your disposal, and how you operate it in relation to the other elements of winning a war, as it were.
It's interesting. Sorry,
John.
That's
right.
Go on.
No, you were talking about criticisms of Montgomery earlier on when we started, and these things have been gone over and over. But he does still get criticised for being a commander who doesn't think in terms of mobility and static lines and fighting the war like the First World War was fought. But actually, I think, as I think you do, that it's a lot more subtle than that. What he's doing is he's getting inside the Germans' command cycle. He's making them react. By sitting still, in certain instances, he's making them react in a way that they don't want to go. If he'd have stayed on the move and looked like a manoeuvre general, he would have been lost in the same way.
Well, and also he knew perfectly how good, when he inherits 8th Army, how good they are at manoeuvre, and it's not particularly good. So what he does is he tries to create situations to draw the Germans into a counterattack, and then wear them down by getting them to make the move,
exactly.
Which is, of course, the thing that then turns into how he does things for the rest of the war. Really.
Well, it's how the Allies do. It's their way of war is developed in the summer of 1942. It's that idea of using firepower. So what you do is you use your armour and your infantry to probe forward, recognising the Germans will always
Without
counterattack
fail,
with Pavlovian predictability. Moment they counterattack, of course, they're then getting up out of their positions and exposing themselves, and that's the point where you go wham and down comes all the firepower. And of course he's got Desert Air Force and the RAF Middle East to kind of support him, which is just, the support of them, particularly at Alamein, 2nd Alamein, is just incalculable.
Okay, we're going to take a short break now. Monty's Humber's just pulling into the service station for a packet of crisps and a Diet Coke. See you in a tick. Welcome back to We Have Ways. Now, during our break then, we got James said, well, we need to talk about the assassination of General Gott. Now, John, you know who General Gott was?
I know who General Gott was.
Straight for Gott.
I wouldn't say I wouldn't have known that he was assassinated. But
well, he was. I know he was shot down. I know he was killed on his way. Well, he was in North Africa. He got there, hadn't he?
Yeah. So he's just been told.
Just taking up command. He was about to take up command of 8th Army.
So he was just about to take up command. He was being summoned back to Cairo. And he went, and the person who brought him in was in I think it was a Vickers Bombay, and the guy who was the pilot was a young guy called Jimmy James, who I got to know very, very well later on in his life, and he's a lovely guy, he's a Welshman, he's a brilliant guy, and he got down, and Gott kept him waiting.
Hang on, before you tell me this, because while we were on the break, James said, well, of course, we've got to talk about the assassination of General Gott, right? Assassination. Now, that's a big word. I mean,
he was definitely assassinated.
What?
Yeah, he 100% was. So what happened was, first of all...
not by Donald Trump.
Maybe his dad, who knows? but yeah, okay. So what happened was so Jimmy James turned up in his Vickers Bombay to go and pick him up from a landing ground at tactical headquarters, 8th Army.
Yeah.
And Gott kept him waiting, and that was really, really bad news on 2 counts. First of all, because the engine started to overheat.
Yeah.
And you had to keep them on. You just didn't want, because of security, you didn't want anyone picking up where they were.
Yeah.
And radio security in North Africa at this stage in the summer of beginning of August 1942 was not great. And they knew that the Germans were listening into them. So if you were going to take any VIPs, you wanted to get them off really, really quickly. So what happens, they've got some wounded guys on the back of the plane, and then Gott turns up, and they goes, right, you ready? They shut the door on him, on the fuselage. Jimmy goes round back, takes off. His handler joins him up front. They take off, and as they're a few miles out, suddenly 6 109s come and strafe them and hit them. And Jimmy has to do a crash landing in the desert, finds a spot to go into, can't get the tail down, just cannot get the tail down. It's still rumbling on, it's on fire, and he cannot get it down. And the planes come back and do another run to try and finish it off. And he was, and even then, that is very unusual, because there was a sort of more gentlemanly war out there, and there was no reason. Once you brought the plane down, that's all you need to do. That's not going to go anywhere again. You don't need to kind of finish it off. Yeah. And they're strafing him again. And you're trying to kill someone. Now, what's very interesting is the plane catches fire, and when the door has been put on the fuselage, the catch has got knocked, and so the guys inside can't get the door out. They can't open it. It's got stuck. So they can't get off the plane. So they all burn to death, including Gott. And Jimmy, although the plane, he's in a complete state, he's badly wounded, badly burned, he managed to drop out of the floor from the hatch underneath the cockpit, rolls away, and literally seconds later, the whole undercarriage collapses. So he is that moment from being squished. He's in a really bad state. Starts walking what he works out is northwards, because they're just south of the Mediterranean line, but within friendly lines, and collapses. of his burns and of all the rest of it, and gets picked up by Bedouins, who then bump into a roving some sappers, who then take him off, and he reports to he reports what's happened and that Gott has been killed and all the rest of it. Years after, he was always convinced that it was a deliberate assassination because of what happened. Years later, literally only 15 years ago, he tracked down the guy who was the commander of the flight of Messerschmitts and met him in Germany. And it turns out that when Herr Clauder turned back to his landing ground, a high-ranking intelligence officer came in and said, "Where is the commander of that flight?" Literally as he was getting out of his Messerschmitt. And he went over to him and he said, "Congratulations, you've just killed the new commander of the 8th Army." And they worked out the timings, and at that moment, Jimmy had not been picked up by the Bedouins.
Well, goodness me.
Yep.
So he was assassinated.
Yeah, and when he told him what had happened, and when Jimmy told Herr Clauder that all these guys had been killed and that Gott had been killed and that also all these wounded men had been killed, he broke down in tears. It's the most amazing story. And I've told you, when he told me for real for the first time, it was in a pub just outside Winchester. Yeah. And I was, jaw open, just listening to this. And he what I've just said in about 4 minutes, he told me in 2 hours. It was amazing. I'll send you the transcript. It's just completely fantastic. In fact, I'll post it up.
But
it's brilliant.
And of course, I mean, the counterfactuals that spin off that.
Yep.
Because because Montgomery's character very much suited the situation he found himself in when he got the 8th Army job.
Yes.
Would Gott have had? I mean, there was a second Battle of Alamein to be won.
Gott was about 43 at the time, but. When Alexander met Gott, because Alexander got out there as Commander-in-Chief Middle East after Auchinleck was fired, before Monty did, obviously, because Gott was going to be his army commander. And when he met him, he thought he seemed tired. And they'd just been through this incredibly long period of, Crusader in the autumn end of 1941.
Not going to make anything stick.
Yeah, and having and I think how wearing it was, this constant battle of commanders where everyone was, because Ritchie wasn't gripping it, Auchinleck was too far away, and so and Ritchie obviously was the precursor before Auchinleck took over direct command of 8th Army. So Ritchie was in charge for Gazala and the fall of Tobruk, and everyone was at loggerheads, and Ritchie just didn't have enough grip to be able to control all his divisional and corps commanders. And they're all just absolutely fighting terribly. And Gott's just come off this incredibly intense period of battle from the 26th of May, which is when Rommel launches the attack of the Panzer Army Africa, all the way through to the fall of Tobruk on the 21st of June, all the way through to the kind of first Battle of Alamein and throughout July. So he's just been at it the whole time. You think of the kind of how tiring it is, just constantly being expected to make command decisions.
Montgomery does is he turns up fresh.
He turns up fresh.
He's been training.
He's good to go.
Been training formations in Britain and isn't worn out, and also it doesn't have all the animus that he may have with his other officers.
He's got no preconceptions about what he's going to
what the different units are capable of, and what and it obviously then has to figure all that out and shake all that down, but arrives fresh. But the other thing, your counterfactual though, because if Gott had got the job, would bells have pealed?
I suspect so. I suspect they would have done, because I think actually a lot of what Montgomery was saying, no more retreats, you've got to go and talk to the front. I mean, that was all steered by Alexander to start off with. Then Monty started to find his own voice and his own confidence out there. I mean, he's that way inclined anyway. But Alexander has already set the parameters when he first comes
John,
out.
did you know this about Gott?
No, not at all. I mean, I knew that Rommel had. I was just thinking while James was talking there. Rommel had an exceptionally good radio intercept service. Yeah. So it wouldn't surprise me that they were listening in on those sorts of discussions. I mean, North African General was very leaky, wasn't there? Because the guy in the American consul who they were listening to, and they kind of knew what 8th Army. I think one of the big sort of things that happened in Alamein was really good for the Allies was when Rommel's radio intercept company gets overrun and basically eliminated.
Yes.
And that is it's sort of one of the things that happens in Alamein that people don't talk about, but actually it was a massive blow to the Africa Corps.
Yes, it absolutely was.
They knew exactly what the British, well, almost exactly what the British were thinking up till that point.
Yep.
And then after that, it was all gone.
But just to go back to Jimmy James, so what was really interesting about him was, you know, when he was in hospital, he kept saying, I've got to tell someone about this. You know, I know this guy was assassinated. And everyone just went, shh, zip it. I mean, literally. You know, and
well, you don't want that. You don't want that.
No, of course you don't.
Abroad.
Of course you don't.
Yeah.
Of course you don't. But he spent kind of 50 years of his post-war life trying to kind of
convince people,
be heard and be convinced, and that's what led him to try and track down Herr Klauder, and he did, and had everything that he had always suspected confirmed.
Well, I think I'm glad we came back from the break. That concludes this very special Imperial War Museum. We have ways. We're here for the afternoon, so we've got more for you. Thanks for listening. Thanks, John.
Cheers, thank you.
Cheerio.